Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when the noise of the day fades, the lights grow dim, and the soul finally has space to speak. Nighttime is not just the end of activity, it is the doorway to divine intervention. What you say before you sleep can determine what you wake up to. Too many people lie down exhausted, burdened, and anxious, unaware that heaven is waiting for a voice of faith to activate its response. Prayer is not a religious ritual reserved for emergencies. It is a legal authorization that grants God access to work in the affairs of humanity. When you understand this, you realize that night prayer is not passive. It is strategic. While your body rests, the spiritual realm remains active. While your eyes are closed, God is still watching. While you sleep, solutions can be arranged, battles can be fought, and doors can be opened. Many people go to bed rehearsing their problems, reliving their fears, and surrendering to worry. But faith teaches us a higher way. The final words you speak before sleep are seeds planted in eternity. They speak either agreement with fear or alignment with purpose. Heaven responds not to desperation, but to faith-filled declaration rooted in divine truth. Tonight's message is an invitation to reclaim the power of intentional prayer before rest. It is about understanding that God does His greatest work when we trust Him enough to release control. When you pray with clarity, confidence, and expectation, you are not hoping for change. You are positioning yourself for it. Something happens when a believer ends the day not with anxiety, but with authority. Something shifts when faith becomes the final voice of the night. And when you learn how to pray before you sleep, you may discover that by morning, God has already been at work. Prayer is authorization for divine intervention because God, in His wisdom, has chosen to govern the earth through partnership with humanity. From the beginning, dominion was entrusted to mankind, not as ownership, but as stewardship. This means that although God is all-powerful, He does not override the authority He has delegated. Prayer, therefore, is not about convincing God to act. It is about granting Him legal access to intervene within the boundaries He Himself established. When a person prays, they are not begging a distant deity. They are activating a covenant principle that invites divine involvement into human circumstances. Many misunderstand prayer as an emotional expression or a religious obligation, but its true nature is far more profound. Prayer is communication that aligns human will with divine intent. Heaven is full of solutions, answers, and resources, but they require earthly authorization to be released. This is why silence is never neutral. When a person refuses to pray, they are not withholding words, they are withholding permission. God responds to agreement, not anxiety, and prayer becomes the point where agreement is established. Every act of divine intervention recorded in Scripture followed an invitation, a request, or a declaration from a human vessel. When people cried out, things shifted. When they spoke, outcomes changed. When they asked, doors opened. Not because God was unaware of their need, but because heaven honors order. Prayer is the protocol that connects the invisible realm with the visible world. Without it, divine power remains present but inactive, available but unauthorized. This understanding transforms prayer from a last resort into a first response. It removes desperation and replaces it with confidence. When someone realizes that prayer is their right and responsibility, they stop approaching God as a victim and begin engaging Him as a partner. Authority does not shout, it speaks with assurance. Prayer spoken from this place carries weight because it is rooted in identity, not emotion. Divine intervention does not violate human will. God does not force His way into situations where He has not been welcomed. Prayer is the invitation that says, you are permitted here. It is the key that unlocks divine activity in families, communities, nations, and personal lives. This is why the absence of prayer often results in stagnation, not because God is unwilling, but because access has not been granted. When a believer understands this, their prayer life changes. They stop repeating empty words and begin declaring divine truth. They stop focusing on problems and start authorizing solutions. Prayer becomes intentional, deliberate, and expectant. Each word spoken is an agreement with heaven. Each declaration and activation of divine resources already prepared. This is especially powerful at night, when the distractions of the day have ceased and the heart is most honest. The body rests, but authority does not sleep. Prayer before rest becomes an act of trust and governance. It hands the affairs of the day over to God with clarity and confidence. While the mind settles, the spiritual transaction has already taken place, granting heaven permission to operate where human effort has ended. When prayer is understood as authorization, fear loses its voice. Worry is exposed as unauthorized meditation. Faith becomes the final instruction released into the atmosphere. God responds not to panic, but to alignment. The believer who prays with understanding is not hoping for intervention. They are activating it through divine order, releasing heaven to move within the boundaries of earthly authority, allowing God to work in ways unseen while the world grows. Quiet, and the night unfolds under the watchful obedience of faith. Nighttime is a strategic spiritual gateway because it represents a shift from human activity to divine operation. When the day ends, strength fails, plans pause, and control is released. The night exposes the limits of human ability and highlights the necessity of trust. It is not merely a period of darkness, it is a divinely designed interval where dependence replaces effort. Throughout history, the night has been the setting for encounters, instructions, and supernatural shifts because it strips away distraction and confronts the soul with stillness. During the day, people rely on visibility, logic, schedules, and systems. At night, vision is reduced, noise is minimized, and certainty is tested. This is why fear often intensifies after sunset. The mind replays concerns, imagines outcomes, and magnifies uncertainty. Yet what many interpret as vulnerability is actually opportunity. Nighttime does not weaken spiritual authority, it amplifies it. When external supports are quiet, the inner voice becomes louder, and faith gains room to speak. The spiritual realm does not operate on daylight cycles. While the body rests, the unseen world remains active. Angels do not sleep, divine processes do not pause, and purpose does not shut down. Night becomes the perfect environment for spiritual transactions because human interference is reduced. This is why intentional prayer at night carries a unique potency. It is N-O-T rushed, not crowded by obligations, and not diluted by performance. It is offered from a place of surrender rather than strain. Night also represents transition. It is the bridge between what has been and what is coming. What enters the night unresolved often follows into the morning unless it is addressed with faith. This is why the final thoughts and declarations before sleep matter deeply. The night receives whatever is released into it. Anxiety plants seeds of unrest, but faith plants expectations of divine movement. The atmosphere of the night is highly receptive because the soul is open and defenses are lowered. Many breakthroughs occur when the believer learns to treat the night as sacred territory rather than wasted hours. Silence becomes an altar, rest becomes an act of trust, and prayer becomes the final instruction given to the day. When someone prays at night with intention, they are not reacting to fear, they are governing the unseen. They are establishing spiritual boundaries over their sleep, their household, and their future. The night listens to authority. There is also a principle of rest that operates spiritually. God works where humans stop striving. Nighttime forces rest, and rest creates space for God to move without competition. This is why attempting to solve everything through effort often leads to exhaustion, while trusting God through prayer leads to peace. Night prayer says, I have done what I can, now I release what I cannot, and heaven responds to that release. The night reveals what truly rules the heart. If fear dominates, it speaks loudest in the dark. If faith is cultivated, it becomes strongest when the lights go out. This is not accidental. Night tests belief because it removes visible reassurance. Choosing to pray in that moment is an act of courage and alignment. It declares trust not in what is seen, but in what is promised. Spiritually, night is a womb. What is conceived there often manifests in daylight. Decisions made in faith during the night influence clarity, strength, and direction in the morning. This is why intentional night prayer is not passive waiting, but active preparation. It positions the believer to wake up aligned rather than anxious, focused rather than fearful, strengthened rather than scattered. When the night is understood as a gateway rather than a threat, its purpose changes. Darkness no longer intimidates because faith has already spoken. Rest becomes confidence instead of escape. The believer no longer fears what might happen while they sleep because they have already entrusted the night to God's authority, releasing peace, clarity, and divine order into the unseen hours where God continues to move beyond human awareness. Words spoken before sleep shape outcomes because language is not merely a tool of expression. It is a vehicle of creation. Human beings were designed to function through speech, not silence. What is consistently spoken gains permission to exist, and what T is repeatedly declared gains momentum. The final words released before rest are not casual sounds drifting into the dark. They are instructions sent into the unseen realm. When the body shuts down and the conscious mind relaxes, those words continue to echo, carrying authority into places effort cannot reach. The mind does not power off when sleep begins, it transitions. Whatever dominates the heart at night becomes the background program running beneath consciousness. This is why careless speech before sleep can produce restless nights, heavy mornings, and recurring cycles of discouragement. Words spoken in fatigue often bypass filters and reveal true beliefs. They either reinforce limitation or align with purpose. The night does not argue with what is spoken, it receives it. Speech has the power to frame expectation. When someone ends the day declaring defeat, fear, or hopelessness, they are not just describing how they feel, they are setting parameters for what they expect. Expectation is a magnet. It quietly pulls experiences into alignment with belief. This is why faith-filled declarations before sleep are so powerful. They establish spiritual expectation before the mind enters rest, allowing peace and confidence to take root while resistance is low. Many people unknowingly sabotage tomorrow with the words they speak tonight. Complaints, worries, and negative confessions become the last agreement of the day. These words do not disappear at midnight. They linger, ping thought patterns, emotional responses, and even decisions. When morning comes, the atmosphere has already been influenced by what was spoken the night before. The outcome feels sudden, but the cause was planted in silence. Words spoken before sleep also influence identity. Repeated declarations form self-perception. If someone consistently speaks weakness, failure, or unworthiness at night, those ideas settle deep within the subconscious. Over time, they become accepted truth rather than passing thoughts. But when a person intentionally speaks truth, promise, and purpose before sleep, they reinforce who they are and what they are becoming. Identity grows in agreement, not effort. There is a reason moments of prayer, reflection, and confession are most effective at night. The soul is open, defenses are down, and distractions are minimal. This makes nighttime speech incredibly formative. What is whispered in the quiet carries weight because it is sincere. Heaven responds to alignment, and alignment is often revealed in what someone says when no one else is listening. Faith-filled words before sleep do not deny reality, they define authority over it. They acknowledge challenges without surrendering to them. Declaring trust, peace, and expectation is not pretending everything is perfect, it is choosing which voice will have the final word. The last voice heard before rest often becomes the loudest voice the next day. Words also shape emotional atmosphere. Anxiety feeds in repetition. The more it is spoken, the stronger it grows. But peace functions the same way. Speaking calm, assurance, and trust before sleep settles the nervous system and quiets internal chaos. The body responds to language. Stress hormones decrease when words of safety and faith are spoken. Rest becomes deeper because the soul feels secure. Spiritual authority is exercised through speech. Silence does not neutralize fear. It allows it to speak unchecked. When a believer intentionally declares truth before sleep, they are not just calming themselves. They are setting spiritual boundaries. They are deciding what is allowed access to their rest, their thoughts, and their future. The night respects clarity. What is spoken before sleep often becomes the lens through which the next day is interpreted. If expectation is negative, even good opportunities can feel heavy. If expectation is hopeful, challenges are approached with confidence. This is why intentional nighttime speech is not optional for those who desire consistent growth. It is maintenance for the soul and alignment for purpose. The discipline of ending the day with faith-filled words trains the heart to default to trust rather than fear. Over time, it reshapes internal dialogue. The believer begins to wake up with clarity instead of confusion, strength instead of strain, confidence instead of hesitation. Outcomes shift not because circumstances magically change, but because authority has been consistently released. Through intentional speech, allowing the unseen to be shaped before the visible ever has the chance to respond. Faith activates heaven while you rest because faith is not dependent on physical movement, mental strain, or visible effort. Faith operates beyond the limits of the body. When the body lies down and activity ceases, faith remains fully functional. This reveals a powerful truth. The effectiveness of faith is not measured by how busy you are, but by how aligned you are. Rest does not suspend spiritual authority, it proves trust in divine governance. Many believe that constant activity is required to produce results, yet faith teaches the opposite. Faith works best when striving stops. Rest becomes the evidence of confidence. When a believer rests after releasing faith, it signals agreement with the belief that God is able to act without human assistance. Heaven responds to trust, not tension. Faith does not panic when control is released, it thrives in surrender. While the body sleeps, faith continues to operate through what has already been declared and believed. The unseen realm responds to settled conviction, not repeated effort. This is why faith-filled prayer before rest is so powerful. It is not followed by anxious monitoring or compulsive repetition. It is released and left in God's care. Faith understands that once authorization is given, heaven does not need supervision. Rest exposes what one truly believes. If anxiety rises the moment the body slows down, and it reveals misplaced trust. But when peace accompanies rest, it demonstrates confidence in divine faithfulness. Faith is proven when nothing is being done. The ability to sleep peacefully in the midst of unresolved circumstances is not indifference, it is spiritual maturity. It declares that trust has replaced fear. Faith activates heaven because heaven honors alignment. When belief, speech, and expectation agree, divine activity is released. Rest becomes the environment where that alignment is protected. Striving introduces interference. Anxiety creates contradiction. But rest maintains clarity. It allows faith to remain undisturbed, giving heaven space to work without resistance from human doubt. Throughout spiritual history, rest has often preceded breakthrough. The pattern is consistent, instruction is given, faith is released, and rest follows. The rest is not inactivity, it is expectation. It is the quiet confidence that something has been set in motion. Faith does not need to see immediate results to remain secure. It trusts the process because it trusts the source. When someone rests in faith, they are declaring that outcomes are not dependent on their constant effort. This dismantles pride and fear simultaneously. Pride believes it must control everything. Fear believes everything will collapse without control. Faith rejects both. It rests in the assurance that God remains sovereign even when humans stop striving. Heaven is not activated by exhaustion. It is seativated by belief. Rest allows belief to remain pure. When the body is tired, the mind often becomes vulnerable to doubt. Choosing rest after prayer is an act of protection. It preserves the integrity of faith. It prevents the heart from revisiting what has already been entrusted to God. Faith during rest also influences the subconscious. Sleep is a state where resistance is low and internal processing is high. When faith has been established before sleep, it continues to shape thought patterns, emotional responses, and internal narratives throughout the night. This is why waking up after a night of faith-filled rest often brings clarity and peace, even if circumstances have not yet changed. Rest is also a declaration of worth. It says that one's value is not tied to productivity or control. Faith allows rest because it understands identity. The believer knows they are not the source, they are the steward. God does not require exhaustion to prove devotion. He responds to trust expressed through obedience and rest. Faith activates heaven while you rest because rest removes interference. It silences self-effort and amplifies divine authority. The believer who sleeps in faith is not disengaged, they are positioned. They have aligned their heart, released their trust, and allowed heaven to move without interruption. Confident that while the body is still, divine purpose remains active, orchestrating outcomes beyond human awareness and effort. God works when control is surrendered because surrender is the language of trust. Control is rooted in fear. the fear that if you let go, everything will fall apart. Surrender, however, is rooted in confidence, the assurance that God is more capable of governing outcomes than human effort ever could be. When control is released, it is not abandonment of responsibility, it is alignment with divine order. It is the recognition that human ability has limits, but God's authority does not. Control gives the illusion of security while silently breeding anxiety. The more a person tries to manage every outcome, the more pressure they carry. Surrender removes that burden. It acknowledges that while humans are called to be faithful, they are not called to be omnipotent. God never asked humanity to carry the weight of results. He asked for obedience, trust, and alignment. Surrender creates the space where God can operate freely, without resistance from human interference. Many people pray, but never surrender. They speak words of faith, yet continue to rehearse fear internally. This creates contradiction. God responds to alignment, not conflict. Surrender resolves that conflict. It says, I have released what I cannot control and entrusted it to one who can. When surrender becomes genuine, peace follows naturally, not because circumstances change immediately, but because authority has been correctly assigned. Control often masquerades as responsibility, but there is a difference between stewardship and control. RDship does what is required and then releases the outcome. Control refuses to let go even after obedience has been fulfilled. God works in the space beyond obedience, not in the anxiety that follows disobedient attachment. Surrender marks the point where obedience ends and trust begins. When control is surrendered, clarity increases. Anxiety clouds judgment, but surrender sharpens perception. Fear-driven control narrows vision, while trust-driven surrender expands it. God often waits for surrender, not because he is unwilling to act, but because control blocks access. Divine wisdom cannot flow into a heart crowded by worry. Surrender clears that space. There is also humility in surrender. It acknowledges dependency without shame. It recognizes that human strength was never meant to replace divine guidance. God is not threatened by weakness. He responds to it. Surrender is an admission that help is needed, not as desperation, but as design. Humanity was created to function in partnership, not isolation. Surrender shifts responsibility from pressure to purpose. When a believer stops trying to force outcomes, they begin to notice direction more clearly. God works not through manipulation, but through alignment. The moment control is released, guidance becomes easier to follow because fear is no longer distorting priorities. Decisions made from surrender are calmer, wiser, and more sustainable. Control also limits timing. Human impatience pushes for immediate results, often before character and capacity are ready. Surrender trusts timing. It understands that delay is not denial and waiting is not weakness. God works in preparation as much as manifestation. Surrender allows him to complete the process without interference. When control is surrendered at night, rest becomes possible. Sleep itself is an act of surrender. It admits that consciousness must pause and that the world will continue without constant oversight. Choosing to sleep in faith is choosing to trust God with vulnerability. It declares that protection, provision, and progress do not depend on vigilance, but on divine care. Surrender also dismantles the fear of loss. Control clings tightly because it fears that letting go will result in failure. Surrender understands that what is truly assigned by God cannot be lost through trust. What is lost through surrender was never meant to be carried through control. This realization brings freedom. It releases the heart from the exhausting cycle of grasping and guarding. God works when control is surrendered because surrender invites cooperation rather than resistance. It removes the struggle for dominance and replaces it with partnership. The believer stops wrestling outcomes and starts receiving instruction. The soul becomes teachable. The heart becomes receptive. Faith becomes stable. In surrender, effort is no longer wasted on anxiety, and energy is redirected toward obedience, clarity, and trust, allowing God to move with authority. In areas once blocked by fear-driven control. Prayer aligns you with purpose, not fear, because its primary function is not to inform God, but to transform the one who prays. Fear thrives in isolation, uncertainty, and imagination. Purpose thrives in alignment, clarity, and truth. When a person prays, they step out of internal chaos and into divine order. Prayer recalibrates focus. It shifts attention from what might go wrong to what has already been established by God's intent. Fear exaggerates problems and minimizes possibility. Purpose does the opposite. Prayer creates the environment where this shift occurs. In prayer, the noise of fear is confronted and corrected. Truth replaces speculation. Faith replaces anxiety. The heart begins to settle, not because circumstances have changed, but because perspective has. Alignment brings peace long before resolution arrives. Purpose is not discovered through panic. Fear clouds discernment and distorts priorities. Prayer clears that fog. It recenters the heart on divine direction rather than human reaction. When someone prays, they are not escaping reality, they are interpreting it correctly. They begin to see challenges through the lens of calling instead of threat. This is why prayer often brings clarity rather than instant answers. Fear is rooted in loss of control, but purpose is rooted in assignment. Prayer reminds the believer of why they are here and what they are called to steward. When purpose is remembered, fear loses its grip. Problems become context, not identity. Obstacles become part of the process, not evidence of failure. Prayer reestablishes this truth repeatedly. Alignment through prayer also corrects motivation. Fear-driven decisions are reactive. Purpose-driven decisions are intentional. In prayer, intentions are examined and refined. The believer begins to desire what aligns with divine will rather than what merely feels safe. This shift is subtle but powerful. It moves the heart from self-preservation to obedience. Prayer also exposes false urgencies created by fear. Fear demands immediate action, often without wisdom. Purpose understands timing. In prayer, urgency is filtered through discernment. Not every open door is meant to be entered. Not every challenge requires confrontation. Prayer brings restraint where fear pushes impulse. It teaches when to move and when to wait. When prayer becomes consistent, fear loses familiarity. The mind learns to default, to trust instead of worry. This does not mean fear never appears, but it no longer governs behavior. Prayer interrupts fear's narrative and replaces it with truth. Over time, this reshapes internal dialogue. The believer begins to think in alignment with purpose rather than react to emotion. Prayer also aligns emotional health with spiritual truth. Fear often manifests physically through tension, restlessness, and exhaustion. Purpose brings peace that affects the body as well as the mind. Prayer releases emotional weight. It allows concerns to be expressed without being empowered. Speaking fears in the presence of God removes their authority. They are acknowledged but not enthroned. Purpose is sustained through relationship, not performance. Prayer reinforces that relationship. It reminds the believer that they are not walking alone. Fear thrives on isolation, but prayer affirms companionship. Knowing God is present changes how uncertainty is experienced. Challenges no longer feel threatening when they are faced with divine support. Alignment with purpose also brings resilience. Fear weakens resolve, but purpose strengthens endurance. Prayer renews commitment during difficult seasons. It reconnects the believer to vision when progress feels slow. This renewal prevents burnout and discouragement. Purpose remains intact even when circumstances fluctuate. Prayer does not eliminate difficulty, but it eliminates confusion about meaning. Fear asks, what if? Purpose asks, what now? Prayer facilitates this transition. It moves the heart from hypothetical disaster to present obedience. Each step becomes clearer when purpose leads rather than fear. When prayer aligns you with purpose, decisions become simpler. Not easier, but clearer. The believer no longer chases peace through avoidance, but through obedience. Fear loses its power because it no longer defines direction. Purpose becomes the compass. Prayer becomes the recalibration that keeps the heart aligned, steady, and focused, allowing faith to guide action without being hijacked by anxiety or doubt. Rest becomes trust when faith leads, because true rest is not the absence of activity, but the presence of confidence. Many people lie down physically while remaining mentally alert, emotionally tense, and spiritually unsettled. This is not rest, it is withdrawal. Faith transforms rest into trust by shifting the heart from self-reliance to divine reliance. When faith leads, rest is no longer an escape from responsibility, but an affirmation that responsibility has been rightly placed. Without faith, rest feels risky. The mind resists slowing down because it believes vigilance is protection. Thoughts race, scenarios multiply, and the fear of losing control keeps the heart on edge. Faith challenges this illusion. It teaches that control is not safety and that constant alertness is not wisdom. Faith declares that God remains active even when humans pause. This belief allows the body to rest without guilt, the mind to quiet without fear. Trust is revealed in what a person does when they stop doing everything else. Rest exposes belief. If anxiety intensifies in stillness, it reveals where trust has been misplaced. Faith gently redirects that trust. It reminds the heart that outcomes are not sustained by effort alone. Rest led by faith becomes an act of agreement with divine sufficiency. It says, I have released what I cannot carry. Faith-led rest is intentional. It is not collapse from exhaustion, but choice rooted in confidence. When a believer rests in faith, they are not ignoring problems. They are acknowledging that solutions do not require constant supervision. This kind of rest is discipline. It follows prayer, reflection, and surrender. It is the posture of someone who has done what is required and now trusts God with what remains. There is vulnerability in rest. Sleep requires letting go of awareness, defense, and control. Faith makes this vulnerability possible. It reassures the heart that protection does not end when consciousness does. Trust replaces hypervigilance. The soul learns that safety is not maintained through constant monitoring, but through divine covering. Faith-led rest also reshapes identity. Many people equate worth with productivity. Rest feels undeserved unless everything is finished. Faith dismantles this mindset. It affirms that value is not earned through exhaustion. Rest becomes a declaration of identity rather than a reward for performance. The believer rests not because all tasks are complete, but because trust is complete. When faith leads, rest becomes restorative rather than restless. The body responds to the soul's assurance, muscles relax, breathing deepens, and the nervous system calms. This is not merely physical benefit. It is spiritual alignment manifesting in the body. Peace is not forced, it flows naturally from trust. Faith-led rest also guards the heart against burnout. Constant striving drains joy and dulls discernment. Rest restores perspective. It allows clarity to return and priorities to realign. Faith understands that effectiveness is sustained through rhythm, not relentless effort. Rest is part of obedience, not a deviation from it. There is also a prophetic aspect to rest. Choosing rest in uncertain seasons sends a message to fear. It declares that panic will not dictate behavior. Faith-led rest resists the pressure to rush ahead of wisdom. It trusts timing. It believes that waiting can be as purposeful as acting. Rest becomes trust when faith leads, because faith removes the need for constant reassurance. It settles the heart in confidence rather than suspense. The believer no longer lies down hoping nothing goes wrong, but rests believing that God is present regardless of what happens. This confidence transforms sleep from vulnerability into security. When faith leads rest, the mind is retrained. Instead of replaying worries, it learns to release them. Instead of anticipating loss, it anticipates guidance. Over time, this reshaping becomes instinctive. The heart learns that rest is not dangerous, it is sacred. Faith-led rest honors divine design. Humans were not created to function without pause. Rest acknowledges limits without shame. It accepts dependency without fear. Trust fills the space where control once lived. The believer no longer fights stillness, but embraces it as an expression of faith, allowing rest to become a living testimony of trust rather than a momentary pause in anxiety. Morning results are birthed by night prayers because the unseen always precedes the seen. What manifests in daylight is often the outcome of spiritual activity that took place when no one was watching. Night prayer positions the believer to influence tomorrow before it arrives. While the world sleeps, faith speaks, alignment is established, and authority is released. The morning may feel sudden, but its outcomes are rarely accidental. Night prayers work because they are offered when distractions are minimal and sincerity is highest. There is less performance and more honesty. The soul is exposed and intention is clear. What is spoken in those quiet hours carries weight because it comes from a place of reflection rather than reaction. These prayers do not compete with noise. They settle deeply into the heart and the spiritual atmosphere. The night is a period of transition. It bridges what has ended and what is about to begin. Prayer during this time influences the direction of that transition. What is entrusted to God before sleep is carried into the unseen realm where divine processes operate beyond human awareness. By morning, alignment has already been established, and the believer steps into what was prepared overnight. Morning results are often interpreted as coincidence, but faith understands sequence. Prayer plants, the night nurtures, and the morning reveals. The absence of visible change during the night does not indicate inactivity. Growth often happens in darkness. Just as seeds develop beneath the soil before breaking the surface, spiritual outcomes form before they appear. Night prayer also protects the heart from waking into confusion. When the night is surrendered in prayer, the morning begins with clarity rather than chaos. Decisions feel lighter, direction feels steadier. The believer wakes up aligned rather than anxious. This internal posture affects external results. Peace influences perception, and perception influences action. There is also a principle of expectation at work. What someone anticipates before sleep shapes how they engage the next day. Night prayer sets expectation and faith rather than fear. Instead of waking up braced for trouble, the believer wakes up prepared for purpose. This shift in expectation opens the heart to recognize opportunities that might otherwise be overlooked. Morning strength is also linked to night prayer. Emotional and spiritual fatigue often stems from unresolved thoughts carried into sleep. Night prayer releases those burdens. It hands them to God, allowing rest to be restorative rather than restless. By morning, strength is renewed, not because problems vanish, but because weight was lifted. Night prayer establishes spiritual koveri. It sets boundaries over the mind, body, and future. The believer does not wake up vulnerable to whatever the day brings because they have already entrusted the day to God. This sense of covering produces confidence. Confidence affects posture, speech, and decision-making throughout the day. Consistency in night prayer builds spiritual momentum. Each night reinforces alignment. Each morning reflects accumulated trust. Over time, patterns change. Cycles of anxiety are replaced with rhythms of peace. Confusion gives way to clarity. Progress becomes steady rather than sporadic. Morning results are also shaped by what is released emotionally at night. Forgiveness, gratitude, and surrender. Spoken before sleep cleanse the heart. They prevent bitterness and fear from carrying into the next day. This emotional freedom allows the believer to respond rather than react, to choose wisely rather than impulsively. Night prayer teaches patience. It trusts processes that unfold without immediate feedback. This patience carries into the morning, affecting how challenges are approached. The believer no longer demands instant results, but remains confident in ongoing divine activity. When the morning arrives, it often feels like a continuation rather than a beginning. The atmosphere has already been shaped. The heart has already been aligned. The believer steps into the day not as a victim of circumstance, but as a participant in purpose. What was whispered in faith during the night begin to speak through outcomes, opportunities, and clarity in the morning light, revealing that what God births in secret often emerges with quiet authority at dawn.